Today, we have a fascinating conversation lined up with Robert Richman, a renowned culture strategist. Some might even call him a culture hacker. Robert spent a significant part of his career at Zappos in Las Vegas, a company that's famous, as you probably know, for its exceptional culture. I'm excited to dive into the insights and lessons he learned while at Zappos, especially under the leadership of Tony Hsieh. We explore the innovative practices that made Zappos a model for corporate culture, from their unique recruiting and training processes to the principle of sharing culture to enhance it. Robert has since taken these principles and expanded them through his book, The Culture Blueprint, and his work with major companies like Google and Toyota. In this conversation, we also touch on his concept of culture hacking and how small strategic changes can significantly impact a company's culture. This episode is packed with practical advice and thought-provoking insights on how to build a great place to work. It's perfect for entrepreneurs and leaders who are looking to cultivate a thriving and engaged workplace. So let's get started. Thanks for being here. Hey, Rob, great to see you. Thanks so much for joining us.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
So you're a culture strategist, or some might call you a culture hacker, and you had a chunk of your career at Zappos in Las Vegas. And personally, I can't think of a better company to learn from how to build a great culture. I've only heard such wonderful things about the culture at Zappos, and I can only imagine how fun and valuable it was for you to work there. But just to kick off here today, tell us, what was it like to work at Zappos back then, and what did you learn about company culture?
Oh, wow. It was an absolute blast. It was like going to school every day in college or high school in a good way. It really, it really started with Tony, the CEO, who, made a very interesting decision that I think impacted the culture a lot, which was to share it. And there's kind of this principle of what you share, you get to keep, and what you hoard, you can sometimes lose, especially when it comes to something like this with culture work. So he opened the doors for anybody to come and visit and tour and see it. And those positive reflections that came back every day were part of maintaining the culture. So part of it is the principle of sharing the culture. If you wanted to increase, to document it, to share it, to build it. That was certainly a lesson there. I would say also that the heart of the culture really lied in the recruiting and training departments, because finding the right people who are right fit values-wise over skills was key. And then how they get trained and got up to speed on the culture and know the standards that are being held to. That was absolutely key as well. And there are some principles within there, such as really game design principles. So like the work of Jane McGonigal in Reality is Broken, she goes over game dynamic principles. So for example, one, there's a goal. So with Zappos, the goal was to get in. Once you're in training, doesn't mean you're in the company. It means you're essentially at like Navy SEALs training, and you've got to pass that to get into the company. And then the second factor is there's rules. So the rules are you have to show up at 7 a.m. every day for 4 weeks straight. That develops a lot of accountability by requiring that. And you have to get a 90% or above on the quiz. But the third element is feedback or score. So you keep taking pop quizzes that you know how you're doing, and you get all kinds of mentoring help. And the fourth is the games are opt-in, meaning it's by choice. And that's when Zappos developed the concept of paying people to quit. So within those first 4 weeks, you get up to a month's salary to quit, which really made the people staying consider it an investment in their employment there. So that with recruiting, really hiring according to the values, and then training, really sifting people to make sure, like a Navy SEALs training, that they're the right people. That's, I would say, 90% of the job of culture.
Wow, that's so cool. It's such an interesting thing, especially the way you're phrasing it, to open the doors and allow people in. And as far as I'm aware, Zappos is still doing this, right? So they're still leading in this area, and they're still sharing all this with the world. Mm-hmm. And I still think of when I come across some concepts, some management concepts, like when I think of holacracy, I still think of Zappos, for example, because I know it was one of the experiments that was being run there. So obviously a company that's really valuing innovation in this area and specifically sees culture as a competitive advantage, right?
Right.
And how did that manifest besides being famous? How did it, like, is that what led to the acquisition by Amazon? Is that what did it lead to tremendous profitability? How did we start to measure that?
No, well, that was there's culture and there's what kind of culture you create. So it was a culture of service. So that meant that service didn't just apply to the customer, but all across the board. So developing a really amazing service engagement. That's why Amazon bought it. And, NPS scores, for those who know it, Net Promoter Score, was above 90% on average for 25,000 calls a day. So that superior customer service experience, I think, is part of the culture, which really distinguished the brand.
And so tell us about your journey from being at Zappos to then writing a book. You host a podcast. You really have become an expert in culture hacking and a culture strategist. How did you take those learnings from Zappos and then extend them for yourself?
Yeah, I didn't think much of it at first, but I was friends with a lot of authors in the space. And then I looked down at my Evernote at one point. I said, I have 300 pages of notes on culture. And I said, I think I have a book here. And my friend said, duh, we've been waiting for you to write a book. So I really assembled all those and created the Culture Blueprint, the guide to the high performance workplace. And since then have gone around the world traveling and talking to companies like Google, Eli Lilly, Toyota, Bridgestone Tires, many others about culture, and learned a lot along the way. I think the main lesson I've learned is to distinguish what's kind of the E equals MC squared of culture, which is simplifying something extremely complex.
Right.
And what I see as the simplification of culture is that it rides on trust, but the currency of trust is really in agreements. So how clear are agreements, and are agreements upheld? And that's why at Zappos, with the training I mentioned, you don't just say, yeah, I agree to uphold the values. You literally sign a contract and you swear an oath to uphold them. So that's very, very clear agreement. Most companies' culture are suffering because they don't articulate the agreements well and don't get an opt-in for those agreements and then hold people accountable to those agreements. And I think that especially with corporate culture, that's really the currency of a great culture.
Oh man, that's a big deal, right? Because when I think about how most values exercises, I'll think of it, call it that way, right? Like, so company values get rolled out, they tend to just be like, here they are. We're going to put the posters up on the wall. We're going to send the emails around. Here's the 7 points or what have you. And really, this is not effective if we're not getting buy-in. And it sounds like in some cases having a little ceremony around it, even, right?
I mean, there were some ceremonies around it, but some celebrations and things like that. But it's really comes down to accountability. What agreements and accountability? Is the agreement made clear? Did they consciously agree to it? Which when I talk to audiences, I say there's a difference between implicit and explicit agreement. An implicit agreement is basically lying, and I'll show you how. Like I'll tell you, you're a liar, Alex. Do you believe me that I tell you that you're a liar?
Do I believe you when I tell you that when you tell me that I'm a liar?
Yeah.
No.
Because I can prove it to you.
Okay.
So have you ever clicked a button that says, I read and agree to the terms of service?
Sure.
Without reading it? Yeah. So you said you read it and you said you agree. That's implicit agreement, which is basically like lying. And that's where corporations are falling short. Explicit agreement is like what I did with skydiving. I didn't just sign a contract. I looked into a camera and said, hey, my name's Robert Richman. I know I could die. I absolve the company of responsibility. Right. So that's explicit agreement. Mm-hmm. And I think that that's where it goes wrong. So, if A, do I understand the values? B, do I agree to them and opt into that? And C, do I understand the consequences of not living up to those? And then D, are they finally upheld, or are some people held a little higher above the values than others because they're a strong performer or a strong salesperson? So, it has to go beyond the posters, the events, the hoopla, all that, and into agreements and accountability.
Mm-hmm. And tell us about the trust part of this equation.
Well, if you think about it, like just bring up in your mind a situation. Don't tell me about it. Just bring up in your mind a situation where you lost trust. Okay. Mm-hmm. I would guess that it's one of two things happen. One is somebody somebody agreed to do something and they didn't do it, or you expected somebody to do something or not do something. It wasn't necessarily clearly articulated, but you had an expectation of them to do something or not do something, and they didn't do it. Was it one of those scenarios?
Indeed, yes.
Exactly. So those are both agreements. One is implicit, one's explicit. So trust comes in the form of making the agreements explicit and of what they are, and then making it absolutely clear. And that way, if there's a breakdown in trust, then it's clear, it's documented, it's where it happens. It's no longer like the my word versus your word. That doesn't mean that there's going to be a reconciliation, though, but at least what it does is gets us in the same reality. Too many times I've heard from people, whether on teams or companies, that somebody says, oh, you agreed to this, and then they say, no, I didn't. Or they say, I said this, and they said, no, you never told me that. Right? That's why it's important to really document the agreement so that nobody disagrees on reality. If there's a disagreement on reality, then we're in real trouble. But aside from agreements, I found that consensus reality is actually a key component of culture.
Okay.
So consensus reality, like, let's give you an example here. Like, Alex, what color is this pen?
Seems to be blue.
Blue, right?
Yeah.
So you and I have consensus reality on this pen, right? But if my brother were in the room, we would not have consensus reality because he's colorblind. So consensus reality needs to work with everyone in the culture. And there's only one way that I've found that we can all agree. Maybe you can tell me there's more, but I'll prove to you that we're absolutely in the same consensus reality when I say this. Would you agree or disagree that it is about, or almost exactly, 12:45 p.m. Pacific Standard Time?
Yes.
Right. So we're in the same reality based on time.
Mm-hmm.
So because of that, I found the cultures that come in alignment on time are high performance, while those that are not tend to be really low performing. So I look to companies of, do they start meetings on time? Do they end meetings on time? Do they deliver on time, on deadline, right? So what is the culture's relationship to time? And if you think about it, the most industrious, successful cultures, or countries even, are very meticulous, much more about time than other ones that are not so ambitious and enterprising. And you can see that, like, for example, I shared that concept with a friend of mine. I said, oh, I get it. I'm in two business groups. One is full of hippies, one is full of millionaires. And he said, guess which one is on time all the time, and guess which one's late every time, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I think that what most people don't realize about time is that it's not about respect. It's about power. What do I mean by that? Well, so let's say you're the boss of the company and you come in and you say, oh, sorry, the board held me up at this meeting, right? Now we kind of lose respect for your power because we go, oh, Alex isn't really in charge. The board is. Right. And I learned this from Tony Hsieh at Zappos, who if Jeff Bezos of Amazon had him at a meeting and it was going over, he would say, I got to go. We got to schedule another meeting. Right. Because that's how he is with time, both personally and professionally. So I encourage leaders just to run an experiment and try being on time or really early for everything for 2 weeks and just see how your life changes. Because the other thing about time is when we're late, we're literally trying to bend consensus reality to our favor. Like, oh, I can just squeeze these minutes in, or I can just, I can show up 20 minutes late because it works for my schedule, but that doesn't work for the group schedule. Does that make sense?
It's a power dynamic in, often, right? So who's the last one to show up? The boss, right? For example. So everyone's waiting around and say, okay, boss, you're here. Now we can start. And it's very much a power play.
Yeah. The thing is, it's a power play, but it actually reduces their power and influence.
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's so interesting to think of that concept of time as power. And just as a total side note, it always makes me think about this idea where people are afraid of discipline, or they're afraid of certain structure in their life. And I would say, hey, if you're disciplined, that's actually where the freedom is, right? Because then think of all the things you can do because you're disciplined. So same thing like you're saying there in terms of like managing and having control of your time versus just letting it go.
Totally.
Because at the end of the day, it's our number one currency, time.
Yes,
right?
Exactly.
Now, tell us a little bit. Share with us the concept of culture hacking, and what does this mean? If an entrepreneur is looking at their company, or a leader is looking at their company, what are the vulnerable spots they might be looking for in their culture? Like, what can they do about this?
Yeah, the vulnerable spots would be any place in culture where it can either go well or off the rails, and it can have a huge impact. So the most obvious example of this is the interview, right? You could get somebody in there who's amazing for your company, saves your life in a way. You get somebody in there who commits gross negligence, brings down the company. Very, very vulnerable spot. So what hackers do is they look at the whole network. They don't need to know the whole network. They just find the vulnerable spot and then they hack it, right? So with the interview process, it's really about the questions. So there would be interesting questions like one's proven to be well for team players, for example, is how lucky are you on a scale from 0 to 10? Because people who have really high scores on that, 10 can be a little bit iffy because sometimes they're lazy, but 7, 8, 9 are really strong choices. Where somebody who says number like 1, oh, I've never been lucky. I've had to fight for everything my whole life. Nobody's ever helped me. I've had to do everything on my own. They're not such great team players. So it's asking high leverage questions based on values, based on these types of things where even scenarios so that's an example of culture hacking where you hack at the questions to figure out how to get somebody who's a real fit in that vulnerable moment, which is the interview.
Wow. So one of the best ways to determine if someone's going to be a team player or not is to ask them, how lucky are you on a scale of 1 to 10? Because the lucky ones, or the people who answer higher, will say, I'm lucky, which number one, maybe indicates that they're more positively inclined, but number two, they're likely to see how other people helped them get there or what they did to contribute to this quote unquote luck.
Exactly.
Okay. What are, this is so cool. What are other great interview questions like that?
They're really unique to the culture. So for example, because Zappos is a high service culture, one of the questions is, tell me about a time when you helped somebody out when you didn't have to. That really gets at it. Or embrace and drive change as a value. So tell me about a time where you had to deal with a change. How did you deal with it? Growth and learning is a value. Tell me about the last book you read. Tell me about the last thing you learned. What do you want to learn about, right? So you really take what are the core characteristics and values of an ideal hire, and then figure out values, questions that are not on the nose. You ask them kind of adjacent and around it to figure out if they live their life according to that value.
Yeah. Okay, got it. So we're not just, we're not asking the obvious questions. We're doing the stuff to help have them then connect the dots for us.
Exactly.
All right. What are other examples of these vulnerable spots inside a company?
Another vulnerable one is that first meeting with a manager has with their employee. You can only have that first impression once. So I've got a whole guide in my book, The Culture Blueprint, of questions to ask. Really powerful ones, such as what's the best boss you ever had and why? When I learn about that from you, I'll learn how you like to be managed. I learn like what really gets you going, right? Are you how do you feel safe to say no? A whole list of questions that are in the book, like that's a vulnerable moment in culture. That first day of training. So for example, one of the things Zappos did is rather than immediately spewing all the values and culture and everything, the very first thing is putting the voice to the the employee before the trainer speaks. So the first question is, what do you expect of us as trainers and as the company? And a whole whiteboard of list of expectations is written out, right? Because you want to get, especially as a leader, you want others to talk first, because once you talk, it shuts down the conversation, right? So that first day of training, that first day with the new manager, that first interaction with a customer, first elements are really important because you don't get a second chance at them.
Really big driver of servant leadership there. If you're asking these questions first and like, what do you expect of me? So that's obviously something that's going to come through in that kind of culture is
totally
the idea of servant leadership, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. What do you think these days? There's some controversy, at least I think there's some controversy about one-on-ones, and should people be doing them? What are your recommendations for how to make these really successful?
Yeah, well, first they need to be co-created conversations. So again, starting with the other person, how did you think you did? What were your challenges? Also, giving them time to prepare for it. I think putting people on the spot with it is not really fair. Like, give them the questions in advance. Say what you're going to talk about. Say, come ready to the meeting prepared to talk about these things. The other, I think, is that it's really important to do it at a rate that you can keep up. So I really get sad when I hear people say at their companies, they say, yeah, my boss canceled our one-on-one for the third month in a row, right? So either you got to show up for those meetings or you lose faith, or do it once a quarter instead, or whatever that is. But you lose credibility every time you cancel the meeting. They lose faith in you for that. So I think it's important to have the accountability to show up for them first and foremost. Otherwise, you're going to lose faith in your staff.
When you say that, like, it makes me think that's such a powerful mindset shift for so many leaders, is to remember the commitments you're making to the people on your team.
Yes.
We always remember the commitments we made to the customer or to the boss, But what I hear you talking about is if we don't take care of the people who are on our team, if we don't meet those commitments, if we don't do the things that we said we were going to do, basically we don't have that accountability downward. I mean, you get what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Then that winds up impacting us because they lose trust. The team is less effective. They don't consider us to be, helpful, all that sort of thing in terms of this. So really, the mindset orientation here is like, hey, make sure the commitments you're making across all your different stakeholders.
Totally.
Yeah. Okay, cool. By the way, downward accountability, that's a good phrase.
Yeah, I like that.
Does it exist? Maybe I just came up with that one.
Yeah.
So as a leader, I want to sort of test these culture spots. I want to say, hey, where are there potential risks? There are risks in any of these first time interactions, like you were saying. I want to make sure those processes are really good and really solid. Does this then live with HR? Does this live with the business? I mean, for a lot of entrepreneurs, they're still small, right? In terms of not a big company. Does it live with them? Does everything fall onto the CEO's shoulders? How do we bring this into the company?
I think what most companies need and are missing is some sort of director of communication, because that's where culture lies. It's all in the communication. How are you relating these things? How are you sharing them? How are you getting the message out? So I'm less about a head of culture, because I think the CEO really needs to be owning that as the head of the culture. But I think a head of communication can really take all these on. And then there's a position at Zappos that for the fun stuff that's called the cruise director. And that's the one creating the events and fun and that type of thing like that. So I think those two roles, director of communications and cruise director, really capture the culture responsibilities that are outside of HR. Because I believe putting it outside of HR, because HR's chief role is, what do you think?
What do I think HR's chief role is? Hiring.
Mm-mm. The number one thing that they are accountable for.
Compliance.
Yeah, risk management.
Okay, risk management. Yeah.
Risk management or compliance. They're both similar. Mm-hmm. So that's what they're most held accountable for. They can mess up the hiring a bit and it's okay. They mess up risk. They mess up compliance. That's a really, really bad, big issue, right? So I don't think the people who are promoting the culture and helping it spread and helping develop it and foster it should be the same people as the police force within the company.
Well, it's certainly not going to lead to employee engagement or empowerment, which I know is a big topic for you. So if we pivot into this, universally, people are trying to find ways to make their employees more engaged and more empowered. What are the best ways to do this? What are the wrong things to do? What are the places? And also, what are the times when it's performative in nature versus actually making a difference?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of ways to go about that, because it's a kind of a broad term, but I think it really comes down to the systems that are created, especially within feedback. So what are the feedback systems that are used? There's a great software that does this kind of stuff called 15five.com. That's a great feedback software tool with all kinds of different questions. And then the question becomes, how is that feedback used? So for example, with Zappos, there were 4 questions based on the factors of positive psychology out of Harvard University. 1, do you feel like you have progress? 2, do you feel like you have control of the progress? 3rd, do you feel like you have good relationships? And 4th, do you feel like you have a higher purpose? So it was judging those things. And then another key with this was having the results transparent to the company. So you could see, oh, wow, the marketing department kind of hates their lives right now. And that holds people accountable in the marketing department of those managers, because it's public shaming, essentially. And also, every question on there is answered. It's rerouted to the person who can answer it. It's answered and it's shared with the whole company, right? So feedback is something that I think should not be done as these 360s, and they land in files and you never hear from them again. And you just, how frustrating is it to fill out huge surveys and feel like nothing happens with them? Mm-hmm, totally. So I think that's another key leverage point is feedback surveys for a company, and how you respond to that. And even if you say, look, we can't do this, at least you're saying, we hear you. We hear you with this. Here's the reason why we can't do that. Here's what we can do instead. Right. And I think that's how you zero in on specifically what's going on with engagement with your own company.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And is engagement the same as empowerment here, or are they different concepts?
No, engagement is how how connected to the task somebody is, how much passion they have for it, how much energy they're putting toward it, right? Whereas empowerment has to do with authority. What level of authority do I really have? That's what people are actually talking about when they mean empowered. Because leaders will get frustrated because they say, I empowered them. I said, do whatever you want with this, or that. But the person on the other end is thinking, no, that doesn't feel safe. I know they're saying that, but that doesn't feel safe. Whereas empowerment is more like the policy Zappos had around customer service, which is with guardrails. So for example, the policy is, or was at least, if you can make the customer happy under $100, just do it because we trust you. So that might be a gift certificate. That might mean sending flowers. That might mean getting new shoes, whatever that is, but up to $100. That's true empowerment because you know your safety rails of that. Versus if they said, just make the customer happy, and then you did something out of control, ridiculous, now it doesn't feel so safe anymore. So I think creating authority, bestowing authority and power with guardrails is the ultimate way to empower people.
I like that a lot, actually. Empower people with guardrails. Yeah.
Authority and power plus guardrails. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Great. Thanks for that. The reason that was coming up is we've had a lot of conversations on this podcast around psychological safety, and you sort of alluded to this earlier when you said, when do you say no, or how do you get comfortable saying no and stuff like that. What are your thoughts on how we establish psychological safety inside of a company?
I think it takes. This is one case where I would say a anonymous survey could work, especially at the team level, of just saying, do you feel safe, and why or why not, right? And it can be different for different team members. Some team members are going to say, oh yeah, I feel totally safe, and others going to say, here's the reason I don't feel safe, right? And then I think addressed as a whole, because we're living in a very strange culture times, right? Like talk about things like microaggressions and things like that, where you've got to kind of define what safety are you willing to provide. If somebody says, I don't feel safe to share my political point of views, maybe the answer is we're not creating a workplace for politics. You can do that on your own time. That's a personal decision, and we respect your decision, but this isn't the place for it, right? Or maybe it's a different company. Maybe they welcome it in. Maybe they have space for it. I think that so you got to just really understand what's going on for people that's making them feel unsafe, and then figure out, am I willing to provide this safety? Is this on me? Is this on them? Are they actually in the wrong place? Is there something they need to step up? Is there something we need to step up? So it's going to be really unique not only per company, but even per team.
There were all these recent incidents or episodes where companies came out saying, you know what, this is not a place to have XYZ political discussion. This is not a place to have XYZ social discussion. I don't remember all the companies that were taking a side on this, but there was quite a lot of noise about this. And what they were essentially saying was, look, even if these things are valid within our world, within our culture, within the broader communities, they're not things that are helping us to achieve our mission, or they're distracting, or they're preventing cohesion and unity on the team. And so they, a lot of them made these calls that were like, hey, we're no longer talking about these subjects in our Slack or in our meetings or in our stand-ups or what have you. And there was a lot of conversation on both sides of that. Where do you draw the line there?
I think the purpose of a business is not to is not to bring your whole self there. You're there to I actually wrote a letter that was published in the New York Times about this, where I said it's not about being your whole self at work. It's literally more about being your future self, because you want to grow into the company, and you want to see you grow into the person you want to be. Right. So I think focusing on that, because the purpose of a business is to serve its customers and build up its people. It's pretty simple. Serve the customer in a way that's profitable, build up your people. And where is politics in that? Nowhere. So you have every other place, from your family to social to anywhere else, to talk about that. You could even, if you wanted to, go out with your colleagues and talk about it at a bar. But at the workplace, on the work channels, I don't think it's appropriate.
So when you talk about growing into your future self, that's a big part of what we talk about a lot at the Conscious Entrepreneur. Who am I becoming? Where am I growing? Who am I becoming? Where am I going in my life and in my work, et cetera? you have a program called XPill,
Mhm.
which is all about this. Tell us about that program and how it fits into this idea of growing into your future self.
Yeah, so X pill is a literal pill and an activation process for it. That it's a pill with nothing in it, so it's essentially a placebo. But there's an activation process, and there's a long story behind it. You can find out at xpill.com if you want to see the whole story. But it's really rooted in the Matrix and the red pill, and me asking what if there was a real red pill, and then using a pill to set intentions to it. And so we've worked with hundreds of people with this, and it's literally a pill, and you swallow it with an intention. Ideally with somebody who's activating you, who asks a series of questions to help you dial in what you really want and what your intention is. And what's amazing about it is either people really get what they want within 48 hours, or you see what's in the way of that. So, one woman, and there's absolutely uncanny stories we can't explain of people successful with it. One woman even got on TV the next day on Good Morning America. I'd never been on it. And that's an example of being in alignment with it, right? So an example of not being in alignment is one woman took the X pill for an 8-figure business, and she had a 7-figure business. So it wasn't crazy, but immediately her business crashed, was just destroyed. And she was actually lit up. Her name is Jennifer. And she said, it was only through my business failing that I realized I hate this industry. I hated my role, and I really wanted to do this other thing. And 5 years later, she was crying, saying, if I had continued on that goal, I would have literally died, because I would have worked to the bone. And X pill really saved me from that. So that's what I mean, that you don't get what you want. It's really more of an alignment pill to your reality and reality itself of what's best in a way. And it works on this weird subconscious level. We're actually now going to be working with the university to test it in a clinical study, because people have been using it to help with addictions. It's really amazing the way it works with addictions. And the proof of it that I have is not just the people who have successfully quit an addiction through it, but here's an example of where it worked or didn't work at the same time, right? A woman took it to quit smoking. And she swallowed the pill to quit smoking, but then immediately decided, you know what? I changed my mind, and lit a cigarette. And she was smoking all the time, right? This first draft she pulls off it, she immediately throws up. Her body just completely rejects it. So it's really playing with the unconscious mind and setting an intention to it, and creating alignment to it. So people have used it for everything from health concerns to starting relationships to starting new jobs to developing skills. Or one of my favorite uses is to access intuition. It's weird how it's almost borderline psychic how you can get into it. Like, I took it to know where to live, and I saw a vision of this house that I'm in. And 8 months later, I recognized it because I took the pill and had a vision of this house. So it accesses a strange kind of cosmic Google in a way through this pill in this process.
So, I mean, there's so many questions that come up there. Like, is it effective because I'm doing deep reflection on my intentions? Is it effective because I'm, in effect, outsourcing some of my willpower to it, right? So I'm saying, well, it's happening to me, as opposed to me doing it. Does that therefore free things up for me? So that also comes up. Man, so much stuff around that. How does one do you have the questions to get activated on the website? How does one get started with this activation?
Yeah, it's in the kit that we have on the website. It's really about what comes up. You'll especially know you're ripe for it if you have a clear intention and there's some kind of sensation in your body. So part of the activation process is breathing into those sensations, because the body usually has a lot of resistance, to the point where when we've done it for groups for addiction, the people who really are opposed to it not only don't take the X pill, they literally leave the room. So it's dealing with the sensations that come up as you're approaching it. And then it's dialing in what's not as much what you want as in what feeling that gives you. Because if you think about it, that's really the only reason we're doing a lot of things, is for the feeling that we believe we'll have by doing that thing. And it could be a feeling of accomplishment. It could be a feeling of happiness. And so it dials in the emotion that you want to have, because sometimes when people get to the emotion, the goal changes. You start to realize what it is you really want. So the example I use of this is one woman used it to get a boyfriend, and we started visualizing the scene and the feeling, and she starts imagining the scene and her face is crumpling up. And I'm like, you don't look like you're enjoying this. And she's like, no, I don't know if I even want a relationship. It didn't feel good to her. And we started to breathe into it. That's part of accessing the body. And I said, what's behind it? What are you feeling behind all this? And she said, it's a sense of excitement. And I said, would you rather take it for excitement than a relationship? And she said, yeah. So she took it to be excited, just lit up through the event, and was socializing, having a great time. And 2 weeks later, she goes on a cruise and meets who becomes her boyfriend. So that's what I mean about really getting into alignment and the feeling. And she wanted to access a certain feeling. And by accessing that feeling, that's how she got what she wanted.
That's so cool, man. Congrats on doing that. So
thank you.
Is this mainly for an individual audience, or is this corporate audience too?
Both. I've done it a lot, especially for salespeople, for realtors, solar, MLM, franchises. Did it for 1,000 people at once, 1,000 people taking the pill at once. One-on-one with leaders and coaches and salespeople. So or sometimes in small groups, especially works well in mastermind groups.
I want to come back to something you were saying earlier. In your introduction, you said, I used to work at Zappos and now I do consulting, or I do speaking to all these big companies. And you mentioned a number of big companies. What are they trying to change, or what are they trying to get out of a shift in their culture?
Yeah, I'd say the thing that they want the most that I've heard is really for people to act like owners of the business. That's what every employer really wants.
Easy to say though, right?
Easy to say, really easy to say. But using a process that I use, like Open Space, developed by Harrison Owen, is a great process that crowdsources all of the issues, frustrations. Because what I found is that if you get the recruiting and training right, that's a big if though, because you need to have the right people on board. If you don't, that's a whole nother story. If you got to fire some people, because if you're trying to pave a road over bodies, essentially, right? Like, you need that clear road. You need the good people. So assuming you have the right people, they want to do a good job. There just tends to be a lot in the way that they're frustrated by. And a frustrated employee is so much more valuable than a quiet employee. A quiet employee just wants to duck their head, just do my work, get out of here. Whereas a frustrated one really wants to do a better job, but is mad about the things getting in the way. Yeah. So it's all about how you harness that frustration, learn from it, figure out what can be shifted. That's why something like Open Space, and I create a lot of just free materials around this on openspace.events. That's openspace.events, not .com. And it's a process that crowdsources all the issues and ideas, and leaders are shocked and surprised sometimes of like, wow, I didn't see that was a big problem in the organization. Oh, wait, you didn't think you could do this? Wait, you totally have the authority to do this. So it surfaces those blocks. It's about really removing the blocks rather than it is like even creating something new.
And we can do this Open Space no matter the size of the company. If we're 5 people, 10 people just getting started,
it works best. 50 to 5,000 is really the range.
Okay.
But if it's lower than 50, there's a process called Lean Coffee that you can look up that is addressing more like 1 to 20. 20 to 50 is kind of a strange in-between zone. But either Lean Coffee or Open Space works really well for those.
Okay, cool. Great. One of the, as I kind of wrap up here, I've got a question about the current economic environment, if you will.
Yeah.
2023 was very tough for a lot of people. 2024 is awfully weird and difficult for some people. And it's easy to hear this argument, but I'm curious what you say to people when they take the view that says, hey, culture is something I'm going to invest in when things are going well. When we have the money for it, then I'll do it. But when times are tough, frankly, I'm not going to spend my energy or time or money on culture because I'm too focused on the business or survival or sales or what have you. How do you respond to that sort of comment?
Well, in this case, I don't think they actually understand what culture is, because culture, they'd oftentimes think like, oh, that's the barbecues. Oh, that's even, core values discovery, which that is, but it's called discovery because it's already there. There's already values there. There's already communication. You're never not doing culture. So first is to educate people about culture and understand that it's happening all the time, whether you're investing time and energy or not, and money or not. And then to learn about it, whether my book, The Culture Blueprint, or others, is what it really is, that it exists in communication, that it exists in these implicit and explicit agreements, that it exists in accountability and what people are held responsible and accountable for, and how well articulated are these things. All these are going on, and they're either happening very efficiently and clearly, or they're not. And the opposite of strong culture work is political organizations. because political means it's all personal. It's all, I like Alex, so I'm going to play with him on these rules. I don't like this person as much or trust him as much, so I'm going to give them these rules. And they may not even be articulated. It might just be very subtle. But what culture does is says that the group is more important than the individual, right? And says these are our standards for communicating. Even it comes down to a meeting. Like, how many times have you been to a meeting where somebody thinks it's okay to be on their cell phone and other people think it's an insult? Now, you'd be surprised, but neither are wrong. Like, even like you'd be like, well, why should people be on their phones? Oddly enough, in Hollywood, that's the culture. A friend of mine pitched a show where the woman was on her phone the whole time. Like, she's like, yeah, and he's like, that meeting went horribly. And instead, he actually got the deal. He was shocked. But that's the culture in Hollywood. I would go crazy with that, right? But so the culture isn't about doing the right culture. It's about having the consistent and aligned culture. What's okay? What's not? Is it okay to interrupt and yell at each other? It is at certain companies. That'll get you fired at another company, right? So getting clear on your standards, your agreements, these types of things, it doesn't take as much time and money as you think. But it needs to be addressed because, like I said, culture is happening whether you're paying attention to it or not.
And presumably it's the sort of thing that without direct attention and intention, it probably starts to erode over time. There's gravity associated with this. Yeah,
especially when you're growing, especially when you don't start to recognize people, especially if money starts coloring decisions more than your standards and your values. Especially if you start hiring people who are a lot like you, and then to grow, you have to hire people who are not like you, and you think they're at fault, but they just operate differently. You don't understand how differently they operate, right? So there's all these ways where, with a startup at first, it's really about, in a lot of ways, is about the money. It is about making the money, because the thing is, if you're not clear on that, or at least you don't have to be making money, but if you're not clear on agreeing on that and working your butt off until you get there, there's not going to be a company. So that's where Tony and I actually disagreed. He said that if he started all over again, he would have started with culture work from the beginning. And I think that's kind of like revised history, because the history of Zappos was that it grew and grew and grew for a little while and then paid attention to culture a lot. And that growing part was really about establishing the business model. So again, culture is there on a basic level, and I would pay attention to the agreements. I don't think you need to do core values until you're really more got a flow going. But the things like the agreements, the standards, the rules, those kind of things, that I think would be helpful to do from the beginning.
Now, what are your favorite or recommended measures of success here? Does it all come back to basically whatever is important to the business, or are there other things that I want to be measuring to show how my culture is going up, going down, sideways?
I think a great simple measure is internal INPS scores. So that's asking the question on a scale of 0 to 10, how likely are you to recommend to friends or colleagues to work at this company? That's a great measure from negative 100% to positive 100% on the NPS scale as to whether the company's actually doing well. That's the most basic one, I'd say.
Okay. And for target range, we're looking at what sort of improvements, or what do people typically see?
It ranges per industry is the thing. It would be very, very different working at a bank than working at Zappos, right? But the key is iterative improvements, because the question is not just how likely are you to recommend working here on a scale from 0 to 10, but a follow-up question of what would make that a 10. So what cycles of iteration and feedback are you doing to improve the culture? That's going to be key use of that metric.
Fantastic. Well, hey, Rob Richman, thanks so much for joining us and giving us this culture tour. Congrats on the book. Congrats on your podcast. Congrats on sharing so much of this stuff from your Zappos experience. It was a real pleasure to have you join us.
Thank you, Alex. Thanks for having me.